Red dust swirled over the small town, and the Wyoming sunset felt like blood on an old unhealed wound. On a rough wooden platform in the middle of the crowded square, Clara stood silently, her hands loosely bound with hemp rope, her tangled hair covering her eyes that had lost all hope. It was not the rope, but the curious, contemptuous, and pitiful gazes of the crowd that held her in place. Clara felt every whisper as sharp as a cactus thorn. A cow is worth more than her. Her father's voice rang out hoarse from alcohol and despair. Whoever offers the highest price gets it. Strong hands, hard-working, eats little. His words were like cold bullets piercing Clara's heart, but she stood still, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains stood tall, coldly judging her cruel fate. Her father waved his hand at the crowd as if she were just a living commodity in the market. She heard Thomas's dry, sarcastic laugh. The man who had once called her his wife, now a bitter stranger, standing at the end of the square, one hand on the shoulder of his elderly mother Agnes. Their eyes were malicious and smug. Clara leaned slightly, her old dress fluttering, revealing a deep purple bruise on her ankle, the last remnant of her struggle to escape her fate. $10 came a drawling voice, making Clara shiver. But immediately another voice, deep and solid, like the western soil, cut through the stuffy atmosphere. 15, the crowd parted to let a tall man step forward. Clara's eyes took in his sunburned face, his patched flannel shirt, his calloused hands, the scars on his knuckles. It was Silas, the man who lived out of town, the man the region knew only as a ghost of the mountains. He did not smile, nor did he appear satisfied. His silent gray eyes stared straight at Clara without promise, without pity. Before Clara could understand what was happening, her father quickly grabbed the stack of money, hastily untied the rope, and coldly jerked his chin toward her. Follow him, the whispers and stares continued to haunt Clara as she stepped down her steps, shaking as she followed Silas to the dilapidated carriage. She sat down on the hard wooden seat, her head bowed, her hands shaking slightly. The carriage slowly rolled away, leaving the dusty town behind into the wild, unfamiliar land. Silas said nothing. He drove silently, his eyes on the narrow road that ran straight into the darkening horizon. Beside him, Clara could feel the nervous, tense beat of her heart. A cold feeling crept up her spine. Was Silas any different from the other men? Was he her salvation, or just her new master taking her into another cage, darker and colder? A small wind chime tied to the cart rang out, a fragile, weak sound in the endless space. Clara shivered slightly, but this time not from fear, but because the sound was like a fragile promise in the surrounding darkness. Perhaps just a small hope like that is enough. Where are we going? Clara finally spoke softly, her voice weak, almost a whisper. Silas still did not turn his head, but his voice was low and unhesitating. Go home. Those two words rang out like a silent oath, causing Clara's heart to suddenly ache, whether from pain, fear, or some completely new, unfamiliar emotion that was quietly awakening inside her. The car kept rolling, the distant mountains sharp in the sunset, and Clara, in the vast wilderness, began to wonder if fate could be changed, and if this time she could really belong somewhere. The carriage rattled on the rough road, the mountains swallowed the last ray of sunlight. The wind chimes tinkled, a lonely sound amid the chirping of crickets and the heavy breathing of the flock. Silas drove on in silence, his shoulders hunched, the reins loose in his calloused hands. The air gradually grew colder, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Clara watched the horizon where the stars began to twinkle in the black velvet sky. She wondered if this was freedom or just another cage. The road narrowed, sandwiched between barren cedars and jagged rocks like broken teeth. The carriage stopped in front of a wooden house. The wood had faded over the years. The roof was sagging. A lone lantern hung by the door, its light flickering like a tired eye. 4 small faces peeked out the window, their breath blurring the cracked glass. Clara's chest tightened. Children she never knew. Silas stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel. He did not look at Clara, but unbridled the mule with slow, practiced movements. Clara remained seated in the chair, her fingers lightly stroking the rotten wood, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The door creaked open, so a girl about 10 years old stepped out. Her braids were loose, her eyes were sharp as flint. "Who is it?" the little girl asked, her voice filled with doubt. Silas said simply, without turning around, "She will stay." He carried a bag of flour down from the car, his steps heavy but steady. The children stared, their bare feet scraping against the ground. Clara forced herself to stand. Her legs were stiff, her skirt caught on a nail in a chair. She yanked, the tearing sound faint but clear in the silence of the house. Inside, the wooden house smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. A rickety table, one leg resting on a flat stone. A patched, faded blanket hung over a chair. The children still stared at her, the girl with pigtails, a toothless boy, a dirty-faced one, and the youngest a girl no more than 4 years old holding a rag doll. Their eyes had no warmth, only questions. Clara's throat burned. She turned away, looking at the black kettle in the fireplace, at the broom leaning in the corner, its bristles worn. Silas placed the sack of flour on the table. "Eat," he said, nodding toward the brick, hard loaf of bread. Clara hesitated, then broke off a piece. Her fingers trembled. The children ate in silence, the spoon scraping against the tin bowl. Clara chewed slowly, the bread dry in her mouth. She felt their gazes weigh down on her, heavy as the air before a storm. As night fell, Silas pointed to a cushion beside the fireplace. "Your place," he said, his voice rough but not impolite. Clara nodded, smoothing her skirt with both hands, the thin fabric fraying under her fingers. She lay down, the straw crunching under her back, the blanket heavy with the smell of life. The children slept in the attic, their whispers drifting like leaves. She heard every word clearly. Mom is gone, and she is not Mom. Clara closed her eyes, breathing shallowly, waiting for a scolding, a rough hand, a demand. But nothing. The days passed quickly. Within 2 weeks, the cabin became a world unto itself, cut off by miles of sagebrush and rocks. Clara woke before dawn, her hands finding work before her mind could wander. She swept the house, the sound of the broom rhythmically. She kneaded the dough, her knuckles pressing into the floured wood. She mended her shirt, the needle pricked her thumb. A tiny drop of blood bloomed like a tiny rose. Silas worked on the land, the steady sound of his axe as he chopped down pine, his shadow long in the evening light. He was a man of few words, his words curt but never sharp. He didn't ask for a wife, he didn't ask for anything. The children kept their distance. The eldest, Ellie, watched Clara like a hawk, her eyes narrowing as Clara stirred a stew or patched a torn sleeve. The 2 boys, Jonah and Sam, herded the cattle, their laughter fading as she turned back. The youngest, Lila, clung to the doll, her tiny fingers twisting in its woolen hair. Clara did not push. She moved quietly, her feet light on the creaking boards, her hands busy but gentle. She felt like a ghost in their own house, present but invisible. One morning, Clara found a tin cup, overturned milk spilled on the table. She reached for a rag, her sleeve touching the milk stain. Ellie's voice rang out sharp as a knife. "Don't touch that!" Clara stood frozen, her hand hovering the damp rag in her palm. Ellie's cheeks flushed, her braids bouncing as she snatched the cup. "It's mine," the little girl whispered, her voice breaking. Clara nodded, stepping back, her heart turning to stone in her chest. She turned to the fireplace, stirring the fire, the flames licking the air like a prayer. Silas looked from the doorway, hat in hand, his fingers running along the brim. He didn't speak, just nodded once, his eyes meeting hers. No pity, no judgment, just recognition. Clara sighed, her breath catching the warmth of the fire. She wasn't home yet. No, not exactly home yet, but the walls of the house were no longer like iron bars. For now, that was enough. That silent acceptance, even if it was just a nod, a look, planted a seed of hope in Clara's heart. A fragile hope, but strong enough to keep her. It was a sultry July afternoon. The sky turned gray, swallowing the sunlight. Wyoming summers baked the land, cracking it like old skin. Clara stood at the edge of the cabin, her boots covered in red dust, her canteen heavy in her hand. The garden, once lush, now lies dry and withered. The corn stalks droop, the soybeans orphoball into husks. The stream is dry, the water is only a soft whisper on the rocks. Clara's dress clung to her body, damp with sweat. The hem was frayed from thorns. She poured a small stream of water from the canteen. The earth drank it greedily, giving nothing back. Inside the house, the air was stifling. The children moved slowly, their faces flushed, their voices low. Ellie fanned Lila with a torn newspaper, the pages curled. Jonah chiseled away at a log, his knife scraping off shavings that fell like ash. Sam looked out the window, hands free, a bead of sweat rolling down his cheek. Silas worked in the fields, his axe now silent, his shoulders bent under the weight of the dying crops. Clara saw the worry in his eyes, gray as storm clouds, though he never said it. And then the fever hit suddenly like a steel fist. Silas collapsed beside the woodpile, his shirt soaked with sweat, his breathing ragged. Clara and Jonah, with the extraordinary power of despair, pulled him inside. His body was heavy, his skin hot as a kettle. They laid him on a straw mattress, the straw crunching under his back. Clara knelt down, her hands steady, dipping the cloth into the remaining spring water. She placed it on his forehead, drops of water rolling down his temples, settling in the hollow of his neck. His eyes blinked uncertain, but he gripped her wrist weakly but firmly. "Keep them safe," he whispered, his voice hoarse and dry as dust. That last word was deeply engraved in Clara's heart, becoming a vow of silence. Clara did not sleep. She moved between Silas and the garden, her steps heavy, her hands restless. She carried water from the stream bucket by bucket, her arms aching, the bucket handles cutting into her palms. She poured water on the cracked ground, breathing heavily, her hair loose. The earth was stubborn, but Clara persisted. Her shadow stretched in the moonlight, her hands bleeding. She cared for Silas all night, changing his towels, feeding him soup through his chapped lips. The children looked on, eyes wide, their silence louder than the howling wind. Ellie helped now, too, her hands mimicking Clara's, stirring the fire, folding the damp cloths. Jonah carried the firewood, his missing teeth glistening as Clara nodded her thanks. Sam carried the bucket of water, his small body had to strain. Water spilled out of the bucket's mouth. Lila clung to the doll, whispering to it, her voice a soft prayer. Clara saw their fear, saw their trust. She said nothing about it, just kept moving, stirring, wiping, watering her hands, creating a rhythm against despair. One morning when the dawn was still pale and weak, Clara saw it. A single tomato, small and green, poking up from the cracked earth. It was no bigger than a child's fist. Its stem was frail, its leaves curled, but it was alive. Clara knelt down, her knees sinking into the ground, her fingers hovering over the fruit. She didn't touch it, afraid that it might disappear. Her breath caught, a sound between a laugh and a sob. The garden was still dying, but this one was alive. Stubborn like her, she called to the children. They gathered, bare feet, stirring the dustShe bright with wonder. Ellie touched the tomato skin, her fingers gentle, her braid swaying. Jonah grinned, knife still in hand. Sam bent down, calloused hands resting on his knees. Lila reached out the forgotten doll, her small voice called its name, Red Star. Silas, leaning back on the mattress, looked out the window. His fever had broken, his face pale but steady. Clara met his eyes and he nodded, a faint smile on his lips. That afternoon the tomatoes were ripe, a gentle pale pink against the green. Clara picked it, hand carefully, the fruit warm in the palm of her hand. She carried it into the house, the children following like ducklings. On the table she sliced it with a knife. The juice seeped into the wood, 5 thin slices as thin as hope, one for each person. They ate in silence, the taste sharp and sweet, an explosion of life in their mouths. Clara chewed slowly, her eyes on the wood grain on the table, the juice staining in her fingers. It's not much, but it's everything. A treasure born from resilience, a promise carved from drought. The wooden house was alive again. The air was softer, the fire crackled brighter. Clara washed the knife, her hands steady, the water in the basin catching the light from the lantern. She felt the children's eyes on her, no longer cold, but warm like the fleeting sight of bright red tomatoes. Silas stood up slowly and weakly, placing his hand on the table near hers, not touching, but very close. Wind chimes sing outside. The music is fragile, but not interrupted. Clara looked at the empty plate, at the faint stain of juice, and knew that she had fought for more than just the harvest. She had fought for this, a family, a place, a life reborn from the dust. The carriage creaked into town, its wheels grinding on a layer of dust as thick as ashes. Clara sat next to Silas, her hands clasped together, the hem of her dress hatched but clean. The children sat in the back, their voices low, Lila's doll swinging in her tiny hands. The air smelled faintly of hay and horse sweat. The sun was fierce and unforgiving. Clara's chest tightened as the town square came into view, the old wooden platform still standing, a ghost of the humiliation she had experienced. She smoothed her skirt, her fingers caught in a loose thread, her breathing shallow as a dried-up stream. The department store bell jingled as they entered. Clara carried a basket, walking carefully, her eyes glued to the worn floorboards. The kids scattered, Jonah staring at the plate of peppermints, Ellie clutching a roll of calico. Silas bargained at the counter, his voice calm, exchanging furs for flour and salt. Clara reached for a box of coffee, her hand brushing against a shelf, when a sharp voice cut through the air. "Well, if it weren't for that useless bitch." Thomas, her ex-husband, leaned against a crate, his smile crooked, his eyes glistening like oil. His mother, Agnes, stood beside him, her hat stiff, her lips pursed as if she were tasting sour milk. The shop was silent, the air heavy with staring eyes. Clara stood still, the cold tin box in her hand, her heart pounding in her ears. The word useless fell like a slap, familiar, yet still stinging. Agnes stepped closer, her voice soft but full of venom. "I thought you had disappeared. No man would keep a woman who cannot give birth to a son." Her words dripped, each one like a needle pricking Clara's skin. The basket trembled in her hands, the handle cutting into her palm. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the cracks in the floor, but her legs remained steady, her back as straight as a pine tree. Silas turned from the counter, hat down, gray eyes steady. He walked up to Clara, not touching, but close enough for her to feel his warmth. "Enough," he said, his voice as calm as a river flowing over rocks. "She is worth more than your word." He looked at Thomas and then Agnes, his eyes unwavering. "You abandoned her. You have no right to claim our pain." The store held its breath. Thomas's smile faded, his hands twitching at his sides. Her face was red. Her lips moved, but she couldn't say a word. Silas did not speak loudly. There was no need to. His truth was a hammer, silent but heavy. Clara's throat burned. Her eyes were glued to the floor where a scattered grain of wheat lay like a tiny star. She felt the children behind her, Ellie's sharp intake of breath, the scuff of Jonah's boots, Lila's small hand brushing against her skirt. Thomas muttered something low and harsh and walked away, Agnes following behind like a shadow. The doorbell rang again, piercing in the silence. Clara exhaled, her fingers loosening their grip on the basket. Silas nodded to the shopkeeper, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the coffee. Not a demand, just a gesture. She met his eyes for just a moment and saw no pity, only a quiet respect. Back at the paving, the days grew gentler. Clara chopped onions, the knife moving steadily, tears blurring her eyes but not her heart. She patched a patch on Sam's pants, her needle glinting in the lantern light. She braided Lila's hair, her fingers gentle, the warmth of the little girl, a small support. The children's laughter now filled the wooden house, not loud but continuous, like a stream finding its way. Clara moved between them, her steps lighter, her hands sure. She was not their mother, not by blood, but she was something else, something they had chosen. One evening, as the sun set, dyeing the sky a fiery hue, Clara stood by the stream, a heavy bucket in her hand. The rippling water catches the light, the water surface alive with shimmering golden rays. She thought of the town, of Thomas's smirk, of Agnes's words. They were still there, but less sharp, like a fading bruise under the skin. She set the bucket down, her fingers running along its warped rim, and looked at the cabin. Smoke curled up from the chimney, thin and steady. Inside, Ellie stirs stew. Jonah chisels wood. Lila sings to her dolls. Silas sat by the fire, the axe leaning against the wall, the handle worn from his grip. Clara's chest ached, not from shame, but from something new. Purpose. Not the kind of purpose that screams, but the kind of purpose that grows silently like roots in the soil. She doesn't need to give birth to a child to build a life. She saw it in the patched shirts, the swept floors, the way Lila's hand fit in hers. She saw it in Silas' nod, in the children's eyes that were no longer cold and suspicious. The weight of the bucket is now lighter. The clear water in the bucket reflects the last rays of sunlight. Clara returned to the cabin, her shadow long and steady, her steps. Sure, she belonged to no one but herself, but she belonged here. The years passed. Silas lived his life walking more slowly, his eyes often on the cotton tree. He sat on the porch, his cane tapping lightly on the wooden planks, the laughter of his grandchildren filling the air. The garden is now their work, their hands sowing seeds where Clara once sowed. Silas carved one last thing, a small bird with outstretched wings, and placed it on Clara's stone. Years later, he reunited with her, his breath fading as the sun set the mountains standing there, like old sentinels. They laid him beside her, the ground soft, the oak leaves rustling overhead. The wooden house is old, the logs are faded, the roof is patched by new hands. The grandchildren grew up. Their children ran around the garden, their laughter echoing to Clara's gentle hymns. The not-for-sale sign still stands next to the road. The wood was faded, the letters faded, but it stood firm, rooted deep as an oak tree. Passing travelers saw it, their carriages creaking, their eyes curious. Some people stopped, attracted by the green of the garden, a miracle in the middle of the rocky wilderness. They asked about the sign, and the children would tell the story of an abandoned woman, of a man who gave her a home, of a family that grew from the dust. The garden never fades. It feeds the family, the harvest, shared at tables near and far. Ripe tomatoes, sweet juice, bright skin like Clara's memory. Beans climbed, corn grew tall, and the wildflower seeds Clara had sown dotted the edges of the garden, their petals as soft as her touch. The wind chimes are rusty, but still ringing. The musical notes are a thread through time. They teach their children how to care for the land, to pour water from a warped canteen, to kneel on the ground as Clara once did. As the decades passed, the railroad came, the tracks running around the land, never touching it. The sign still stands there, a silent monument, its promise kept. Travelers still saw it, their horses snorting, their boots stirring up dust. They spoke of the garden of the woman who turned exile into home, drought into bloom. Some say they feel her there in the rustling of leaves and the sound of wind chimes. Her faint spirit in the stark green of the earth. The oak tree grows its roots deep and its branches wide. At its base, two slabs of stone lay side by side, their edges softened by the rain. The garden stretched around them, alive, endless. The children now have gray hair, sometimes standing there, hands full of dirt, eyes looking towards the horizon. They don't talk about Clara and Silas, there's no need to. The land speaks for them, the roots intertwine with the air, the crops are a hymn to their love. And so season after season, the garden still blooms, the sign still stands, the wind chimes still sing. Clara's life, once abandoned, has taken root deeper than flesh and blood, stronger than stone. The Wyoming wilderness holds her story quietly but surely, a testament to a woman who chose each day to turn dust into life and a man who let her do it.